Hope everybody's doing well today. I want to welcome everybody to the Unimpressed podcast today, and I have a very special guest, comedian and writer Michael Rowe.
Thank you, everybody. Don't rush to the stage. Please, somebody will get hurt.
You know, Mike, I have people on here, and I kind of take a different approach. I try to interview people from the ground up, from the foundation up, and just trying to get a little bit about who they are and what they're about and what makes them tick. And, you know, you've had a long career in comedy and you started at a very young age. You know, thinking about that and looking back on that, what was the internal drive for you at such a young age to get into comedy business?
Well, first it was when I was really young. We're talking grammar school, mostly grammar school, where it became that time in life where do you get to hang out with the cool kids, right? And even like 8th grade or so, when kids started to smoke, this was, 70s, and even drink, like start to learn about that. And I didn't want to do it, any of that stuff, but I wanted to hang out with the cool kids. But I found out quickly that if I'm funny, they bring me into the group. Like, that's some good positive reinforcement. So I got to hang out with the cool kids by being funny. And then it just kind of kept expanding from there. It's like getting laughs becomes like a drug. And so that drew me to stand-up comedy. And I'm still living in my hometown in Waterbury, Connecticut, this little factory town. And this is so long ago that it was before every bar and car wash and bowling alley was a comedy club. Like this was before the comedy. So I'm like 16, 17 years old, and I would walk into a bar, and if there was a band playing, I would ask the manager guy or whatever. I said, when they go on a break, could I just go on stage and tell jokes? And most of the time they're like, I guess so. So I'm just this kid now, just mumbling these jokes out, but like I loved it.
You know, you hear that a lot. You think about that feeling you had of those laughs becoming a drug. What type of person is that makeup look like? I don't know if anybody's ever tried to put it in a category or whatever it is, but what would you call that type of person?
Well, I think it makes up for a lot of the things you maybe didn't get, whether it's respect, you think, or if I was not like a fighter guy, I was not a sports guy, but then I found this thing that like almost brought total acceptance. It almost fixed all those things I didn't have. So it's like, all right, I'm getting to know this guy in me. This is a part of me that I want to nurture. And it's the thing that fixed a lot of things in my life, I guess, emotionally and otherwise. But it's just a fun thing, too. It's kind of like, I wasn't into sports, so I maybe liken it to like the sports hero in school who's scoring the touchdowns and becomes revered and respected in some ways. So I'm sure that was part of it,
I mean, and I think, too, is like once you find that, right, and that person finds confidence, then it becomes a voice, right? You want to have more of a voice and more of an expression, if you will.
Yeah.
Is it the confidence puts that behind the voice where you really start to expand that thought process, making people laugh?
I think so. It does. It is a source of confidence for sure. And there's something very powerful about it, that you are able to control feelings and emotions of a room or a arena full of people. That is pretty powerful,
And when did you, starting at a young age, when did you start to feel some of that confidence and that success? How long were you in the business?
I studied stand-up so much that I knew that I was going to be bad for a while. So that was like, it's like it didn't matter because I'm on the ladder. I'm doing it and I'm focused. And the fact that I'm doing it and bombing didn't matter because I was doing it. And part of the big push was when I was 17 or whatever and still living in my hometown and, had my bedroom in the paneled basement, I would record comedians, just get my little cassette player and record them and listen and study them and learn the musicality of it and what's funny about it. I would try myself. I just steal jokes and do them to friends and just to learn, And, of course, my favorite was Rodney Dangerfield back then. And he was on The Tonight Show all the time, back in the days of Johnny Carson. And so one day, Dangerfield is on the panel sitting with Johnny, and it's one of the few times where he kind of got personal and talked about how he started in the Catskills, but he was selling aluminum siding. But he went by the name of Jack Roy. And he also said that he had a comedy club in Manhattan called Dangerfields. So I thought, I know his style so well. What if I sent jokes to Jack Roy at Dangerfields? I figured that would get some attention. So I got my mom's big clunky manual typewriter, and I just kind of typed out a page and a half of jokes or 2 pages of jokes and just what I thought might appeal to him. And I sent them to Jack Roy at Dangerfields in New York. Of course, a couple of weeks go by, and I'm like, I kind of forgot about it. I had no expectations, but you take a swing. But then one night, like after dinner, I'm in my basement and the phone rings. Mike, there's a Rodney on the phone for you. Like, what? And my 17-year-old squeaky voice. Hello, hey Mike, it's Rodney. How you doing? You okay? You all right? Hey, how are you? Oh yeah. Hi. Well, yeah. He said, I got your jokes. They're really good. They're really funny. But they're not for me. But these are good jokes. He kept me on the phone for like 15 minutes and explained comedy to me of like what he knows, because I said I want to do stand up. Don't come to my club. It's no good. And he told me about the Improv and Catch a Rising Star that was around at the time, and go to those clubs. And he told me, he said, look, it took me 8 years to find out what was funny about me. He said, but if you're going in, just expect that. So first of all, at that age, to get the acknowledgement from Rodney Dangerfield was, holy cow. It's like, that's a nice stamp of approval. That's a big vote of confidence. He, in fact, sent me a letter like 2 weeks later, a handwritten letter reminding me, if you do this, it's going to take a long time, but stick with it. And, so that was kind of the crossing of the Rubicon, I guess. That was like the beginning of, saying to my mom, I'm going to do this for my career.
Now, I've talked to a couple of these guys. I had Mark Schiff on the show. Was he around your same time period as you?
Mark Schiff was, in fact, I'll try to tell the story quickly. Okay. In Connecticut, when I was figuring out how do I go to New York City and how do I become a comic, there was like a local radio station had a stand-up comics contest. And the winner was you got to audition at the Improv in New York. And I won the contest. And all of a sudden there's a limo picking up me and my girlfriend, taking us to New York City, going to dinner, and then we're going to audition that night. I'm going to audition that night at the Improv. And like, holy cow, it's like, how did I, and it's a packed house and they're putting me on at prime time. But Mark Schiff was first person that night, the first person ever to introduce me on stage at the Improv. So, yeah, so he holds a place in my heart.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, the reason I brought him up is, he was talking about him and Seinfeld, and, they were writers, right? When you were on stage, did you know you were a writer too? I mean, did you know you were a full-blown writer?
Well, I was
storyteller.
I was so in love with stand-up, but not that long into it, I kind of reached a point where I figured out that I'm not going to be, George Carlin. I'm not going to be Robert Klein. So what happens? What happens when I'm 50? I don't want to be on cruise ships. I mean, I didn't like traveling that much when I was in my 20s. I didn't like the road that much. So I kind of had a reckoning where I had always been kind of writing along the way, even for other comedians. In fact, when I got to New York, I was writing more jokes for Rodney Dangerfield and other people like Rip Taylor and stuff like that. And I was liking writing. So I just reached a point where like, I'm going to start to segue into writing. I think that's going to be my career. In fact, my stand-up, I kind of became more interested in making the comics in the back of the room laugh more than the audience. Yeah. So, the signs were there.
Well, that's an interesting thing because I was kind of, when I got into the comedy, I was kind of disruptor and broke a guy and took him to Just for Laughs with a social media blueprint, right? Totally different from your perspective of where you came from. And you made a statement there about trying to appease industry. Do you think sometimes in the comedy space that people get caught up in an environment where they try to appease industry and maybe forget who's paying the bills? I always say, who's paying the bills or who you're trying to tell that story to?
Certainly as a writer, and especially I've been in development now more than ever since COVID. So I've been working with teams of people and developing stuff with studios and then going to networks and going to, streaming. And I catch myself all too often, like the notes are, a lot of the times they're not helpful or they don't quite make sense or you're trying to figure them out. And then it just becomes, you're trying to hammer everything into what the network people want. And then at some point you end up with something you don't even know what you're writing anymore. So this focus in development in these last few years, I've learned a lot that I have to just stay true to my voice as much as possible. Otherwise, I'm in a place where I just get lost. And,
That's a discussion I had as well with Mark about dilution of story, right? Is there, he was telling me about universal comedy, right? In making universal comedy and finding the right pieces to make universal comedy. You think that threshold of finding the right pieces for universal comedy is at its max now, where we can't stop the pendulum? We're trying to find something that's not there?
No, I think what I've been trying to do, and I think what has to happen, and this is what happens with the most successful people. In fact, I started with Chris Rock. We were pretty close friends back then, and I'm still in touch with him once in a while. And he talked a little bit about how he found his way. It's sort of a complicated story, but it came down to, he always thought he was funny. And for the longest time, there was a disconnect. He's like, the audience isn't liking it. I don't, and he forever tried to figure it out until one night he was at the comic strip. And there was just sort of this swath of people laughing. And he figured, that's kind of what I got to do, is just not try to please everyone. Just find myself. And even if it's just even if it's a small group of people who are going to like me, it's who I am, and that's what matters. It got to the point where he felt like even after Saturday Night Live, he thought his career was over. So he just said, I want to be the best stand-up I can be. That's all I can do. And whatever happens, happens. Whoever finds me, finds me. And then he just became himself. And people slowly were drawn to him. And that's kind of the key. It's like just finding that fingerprint in yourself that's going to draw people in. You just got to, whatever your point of view, weird, or if it's stupid, or if it's just very dry, or what, it's about finding yourself. And that's the key to it.
Kind of weird you say that. You talk about social media, people don't realize it's about sensitivities, right? And, people are attracted by senses. So probably in that experience with Chris Rock, if he brought something from his core foundation and that resonated, with a group of people, then he should have been able to double down on that. Reverse engineer the thought process comedians have today. They might find a quicker path, you think, maybe?
It's bravery of just going, I'm giving you everything I have that I think is interesting about me. And there's that, there's the risk of if I give you everything I have, and if it doesn't find itself, then I have nowhere else to go. So that's kind of the bravery of it, I think. It's just revealing yourself and taking that risk. Because even, my experience in writing half-hour shows and different things, part of what is always the success of half hours, I believe, is those shows come from someone's point of view. It's very specific and it's personal. And what typically happens is, as you're developing shows, you have to dance with all the executives who all have to have notes and ideas and thoughts. And that's a lot of the times why a lot of shows aren't successful, because they get hammered down or they get derailed, and the person who created it loses their vision. So that's why a lot of the more successful shows even happen by accident. They suddenly sneak through without a lot of input before it gets off the ground. I mean, the famous story of Seinfeld, it was not developed through normal half-hour network channels. It was called a variety show because it had Seinfeld doing stand-up in it. So nobody gave them notes. I mean, there was one time where the network had a big note and they gave it to Larry. And Larry, who I also started with Larry in New York, but Larry was great because when the network came to him and said, we got these notes and the way we think you should do it, then Larry was like, well, I'm leaving. I don't want to do it. I'm leaving. Larry just said, I'll go to New York. I'll do stand-up. I don't care. And to have that power, to say, do what you want. I'm out. And then they brought him back in, kept his voice in the show.
Why wouldn't networks realize that? I think if it comes from more of a pure source, right, and it comes from the heart, why wouldn't networks say, hey, we believe in you. It's a people's business. We know you're going to be relatable in this space. Do what you do.
Because then people will start to go, well, I guess they don't need me, and then they're out of a job. And right now, TV is like the Wild West. Everything is changing, and it's in flux. And fortunately, right now, a lot of decisions are being made out of fear. Executives don't know where TV's going or what's expected of them and what the new dynamic is. And So decisions are made mostly about, what's the best decision to keep my job. And that just makes it more difficult. Like, I've never had my own show on the air, really. So, when I'm pitching to a show, they're already not that interested if it's just me. So I now have to, attach a big studio, or if I can attach a big actor or that sort of stuff, that's going to make their choice of saying yes a little safer. So that's very hard.
Well, the other thing they need to realize too, studying human behavior, is tone always works, right?
Yeah.
And I think if you find a tone that works, you shouldn't forget about it, because it always will work. Why do you think old music keeps, coming back? Tone always works.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts about that?
Again, it comes back to what I'm saying, really, because ultimately, tone is produced by someone's point of view, the truth, if there's truth to it, it's sort of like why I like jazz. I mean, because jazz to me is like the emotion just coming right out through the horn. You know what I mean? And as much as I talk about it, I still, for as long as I've been doing it, find it difficult to get there. I'm still searching to be as truthful to my voice, It's easier for some people, but I'm.
Well, what do we not know about Mike Rowe? What have we not seen? What would be his outside of what we've seen?
It's funny. I almost have the same thing with Chris Rock of like a disconnect where I write these half-hour and even a few hour-long pilots that are true to my life, and they seem to not be connecting. It's like what gears are missing? What's because I look at them and I go, well, this is kind of heartfelt stuff, and this is what's interesting to me, and this is the show I would like to see on TV. This is something I would watch. You kind of go through all the checklists of what to you makes it good. Mm-hmm. So now, even after all this time, it's like you get lost. It's like, are they just not good scripts, or do I have to keep fighting for it and getting it to the right people? Or
who's making the decision though? Like, I think you're probably weighing that thought process too much on fractional, decision makers. Because and this goes back to knowing sensitivities on social media. If you took a piece of content, you put that piece of content out in a space, right? Within a space, whatever genre you want to put it out in, right? You do that multiple times, you're going to start to get data back. It's going to tell you what type of person is liking that. So just because 10 people in a room may not like that voice of yours, maybe there's another way to proof the concept.
And this is kind of what I tell everybody who's interested in getting into the writing game is, as much as you have to learn to craft, you have to learn how to be your own agent and manager. Like I talked to writer friends who are like, yeah, I haven't heard from my agent in 6 months. But it's like, well, that's not really how it works. You have to figure out your own ways in. You have to figure out how to make your own contacts. You have to figure out how to get whatever you need to get read. It's if you wait for agents and managers, you're going to be in trouble. And so that's just it. It's like I have to pick the right projects I want to fight for and take out myself and show up at people's doors, so to speak. You're dealing with a lot of gatekeepers. Even the last script I wrote, a pilot I liked, and I give it to my manager, and he's like, I don't know what to do with this. So like, he's supposed to be my partner, and he's sort of the gatekeeper, and if he's not like, I can't send this out. Nobody wants to, see a half hour about a basketball coach. And I'm like, really? Isn't there a basketball thing every other year? So when you get all this kind of mixed input on everything, it's easy to kind of lose your bearings, So that's another part of it is like, well, let me stabilize what I'm writing and doing and assess everybody's responses, and then start to figure out, all right, what's the next best approach to get out into the world and get seen, and what's the best things I have that are going to get noticed. And you start to just lose your sense of like why you're doing this.
Well, I mean, how many Emmys have you won?
I've won.
Been nominated for.
I've been nominated for like 7 or so. I've won one. I've won a couple of animation Emmys, the Annies. Yeah, a couple Writers Guild Awards and that sort of stuff.
Well, you think about that. A guy who's been nominated 7 times for an Emmy, right? and he puts out a piece of work and then says, I don't know what I'm going to do with that. Well, maybe you should listen to that guy. If he's been nominated for seven Emmys.
I know, but it's also here's how writers work typically. It's like if you work on a half-hour show, here's how my mindset is. Like, you work on a half-hour series, and everybody helps build your episode, and you go out and write the first draft, and then it goes back in the room and gets fixed again. So it's always a group effort in a half hour. And I'm a person where, like, if it goes great, if the episode goes great, I go, yeah, we all worked on it. And then if it tanks, I'm like, oh shit, man, I screwed it up. Like, I take the heat for it. You know what I mean? So that's just part of the. It's kind of like a lot of writers I know who kind of think in those terms.
Do you see a medium that would that you would approach that you haven't done before? What do you think is the next step within the industry?
Well, at this time, what's going on in the industry, writing-wise in Hollywood, is they're making sure they get the diversity hires on shows. And that makes it harder for me. I'm also not a young person, so I'm almost not that interested in just being on a staff on a half hour and working till 2 a.m. I've done that a lot. So it's like now, like most of my career, it's always about reinventing yourself and shifting and figuring out. And so I've just been writing a lot of screenplays. You can be any age, not have to work in a room. In fact, I've been writing Lifetime movies, because I write them in 3 weeks and they shoot them in like 2 weeks. But it's just a fun exercise because there's no executives, there's nobody over your shoulder. You can just go, no editors on in your head. And at the same time, too, developing TV, if I can get my own show on, then that's good too. If I'm the guy in charge and, and it's a show that's my voice, then I would be happy to be in the half-hour world, especially animated.
What is animation? I know that Netflix, when I developed that thing with Claudia, she does great work, by the way. I mean, and we had a good time developing the project. But I know right after that, Netflix had a downturn on animation. Is there a trend with animation? Is there something that is out there now or something that's not out there they're looking for? Or I don't know. Do you have any idea about that? Or are they just confused?
Nobody knows anything ever. Nobody really knows what they want. I mean, there'll be meetings at places that say, we want a family half hour and stuff like that. I mean, that's fine, but I don't think you should chase anything ever. You know what I mean? It's sort of like going back to the idea of sticking to your own voice. It's like to write say a half hour of anything because they're saying that's what the network wants, then you're already kind of starting at a deficit. So again, it's always like, I truly believe that if you're creating something they'll like, regardless of what their own agenda is, it'll move forward. I remember pitching a half-hour show with an animated show with Nicolas Cage, right? So we were on the Fox lot and sold it in the room, basically. And then as we're leaving, I ran into another friend who just got out of another pitch. And he said they passed on it because they said they're not buying half-hour animated shows where they just bought one 10 minutes ago. You know what I mean? So you just can't chase anything. You just go with your gut.
Well, when I pitched the animation, I developed this Southern Mom animation, and Netflix kind of put a pause on it with some PC political stuff or whatever. But when I went and initially talked to them, I talked about the numbers first before we even got to the creative. So maybe there's an angle, if you had something where you could bring talent that has numbers with value, that might be an easier way to get it done.
Well, I think too, though, you going in with Claudia and Rough Draft, that alone is a leg up. That makes them feel safer about making a decision because you're in a world where people know exactly what they're doing, So that seems more helpful than anything, that or like walking in with Nicolas Cage people are gonna go, let's take a swing, there's a safety to it.
Yeah. Can we get back to the roots?
I think it's a version of how it's always been. It's corporate mixing with creative. and it's always going to be an issue and a problem. And it's just a matter of playing the game, you know? So again, I feel like truth always wins out. Sometimes people will be lucky and get their show picked up, but if they're not ready or if the voice isn't there, ultimately it always lasts one or maybe two seasons, you know? It sort of happens just through kismet or, you know, whatever. If the moving parts aren't right, then it just doesn't last. So again, it's like finding what's interesting about yourself and being able to figure out how to get it on the page and figure out the verisimilitude of it, you know, figure out how people get to like it too, how we can get people to be drawn to you.
Well, here's another direction I don't think a lot of people talk about in entertainment is the corporations, right? So if the corporations are paying the bills and their rules and regulations, as the world expands, their rules and regulations become more tight, right? And that puts more of a clamp on a great talent like you think, and then the talent, it may not even have nothing to do with the talent, then the talent beats themselves up. Those thoughts never come into play. Do you think that has a little bit to do with it as well, that tight net is getting tighter from what they can and can't do? Or
yeah, I mean, there's always a version of that, and it's always, you know, learning how to kind of ignore it. You have to just learn how to ignore all that stuff, and that's kind of the trick, and maybe part of like why I had so much fun writing a Lifetime movie, because it was an opportunity to not think of like, what are they like? What are the notes that always come down? What do they want to hear? What, you know, it was just like, I'm writing this fun, dumb movie and I'm having a blast, you know? So it's like almost bringing that mindset when I'm writing stuff for a network or stuff like that. I'm not having those voices in my head. I guess too, part of it is, you know, you're in the business long enough, you hear all the notes and the reasons and the things they don't like and the things that always hit a wall, and then suddenly there's more little traps and ghosts in your head telling you what not to do and what to stay away from. So again, learning to ignore that stuff and fight through it and just learn how to play.
And you just said something there about the thoughts in your head. When you're crafting a joke or a character that has a certain tone and a certain voice one day, and then you're trying to craft a joke for another character that has a certain tone and voice on the second day, right? Same project. How do you do that? How do you create that joke for a different tone, and each having its own tone? What is your thought process behind that?
Well, that's just getting to know the character, not only their characteristics, but the character. So that's also a sign of a very good show, is if you can find the jokes from those characters without sounding like a joke. It's as much as possible, not think about a joke, but think about what would be funny about what this person would say that you got to know. You know what I mean? What would come from their life? The shows I have no patience with, the half-hour shows, is when all the sitcom characters talk like jokes from the comics writer's room, from the comedy writer's room. They just sound like jokes that anyone could say. Then I tune out. So it's just a matter of like learning your characters and learning their backstory and their life and what's interesting to them and why they, you know, what they like, what they hate, and what their point of view is, and then find what's funny that would come out of their mouth. And it doesn't, and the more, you know, you have that, the less it sounds like a hard comedy joke.
Well, doesn't that make you a visionary? Because a lot of people, that's why a lot of bad stuff creatively is done, because there's such a disconnect, or it's fractional, it's diluted, right, from source. I mean, doesn't, you know, there's not a lot of people that can see that. You know what I'm saying? Like, see that and something funny to a personality. There's probably a lot more people out there that can't see that.
That's the trick, you know. And that's where the successful shows come from, are the people that can do that, the people that can find the inner life of their characters. Then you're golden. You know, then that's the big key to what are going to draw people in. They become friends with them. Even Futurama, where I was there for like 6-7 seasons or whatever, and you got this big, fantastic, crazy world and interplanetary travel, but ultimately it was about the characters and their dynamics and what's funny about them and their wants and their needs. And you know, the Fry's always going to do kind of the dumb joke, and Bender's always going to do like I want to get drunk joke, or you know. But people came to Futurama because of the characters, and they became friends with the characters, and they loved living in their world with them. In other words, it just can't be like people randomly going on these space adventures and crazy things happen. That's almost secondary. It's like what are the small stories and what are the small stories with these characters, you know?
How many people on a project like that can see that? Or you do someone like you have to take the lead and show them how this works?
No, David Cohen, who co-created Futurama, was very smart and knew he had to find people who thought that way. You know what I mean? So he could look at a sample spec script and see, you know, well, this person's just an old school sitcom writer. You know, he just went through the hiring process and was smart enough to pick out who would be the right puzzle pieces for the show. So it's up to the showrunner to keep the showrunner creator, keep that voice going. It's funny, too, because sometimes you'll see, like, your favorite show, and then 2 or 3 seasons in, it kind of falls apart. That's because that creator usually gets a big offer for a big deal to go on a new show. And then a new showrunner comes in and may not understand the voice of the show. And then fans are suddenly like, why is my show weird now?
Do you have a goal the next 3 years? What do you want to achieve that's different in the next 3 years? Is there something you really, really want to do?
I'm looking to see how much progress I can make in the comedy screenplay world. I'm writing a really dumb comedy now that, again, is fun. And the premise is simply guy didn't pay his late fees on a VHS of Tango and Cash that he got at the Blockbuster. The guy that worked there has been stalking him all these years to get the late fee.
Oh, okay.
And that's just kind of the jumping off point. But it just gets really silly and crazy, and it's just a dumb, fun. And it's funny, one of the things I've learned lately is, like, as I talked about, when you're writing stuff and you think about what will executives say and what's off and what's weird about it. When I write something, too much of the time I'm thinking about what will the market think of this? Is this a viable idea? What are executives going to think? Am I on the right track? And now instead, I have twin boys who are 21, and I know they're friends. So I'm writing now thinking, what would make my sons and their friends laugh? I mean, that's where my head is. And I think it's a much better way to go, you know, a healthier way.
On a daily basis, you just go for your craft? Do you get up and you go to work? Do you write? Is this what you think about every day? You seem very passionate.
Well, I do tell people who are interested in writing that if they're not driven to write at least a few hours a day, then you're probably in trouble. And that just means even if you're writing your own little essay or just tinkering around trying to write jokes or whatever, if you're not driven to write a few hours a day, then you're probably going to have a rough time unless you're some sort of genius or something. Drive to, you know, it has to feel like kind of a drug. It's something you feel like you need to get done.
You feel like you never do anything?
You mean in real life stuff?
Well, it's like I work every day, and I always tell my wife, I don't feel like I got shit done today.
You mean as a writer, you mean?
You ever feel that? No, just as being in the entertainment business, you know, just kind of getting up and doing what you love to do. You have that feeling sometimes you feel like, hey, you might have wrote for 7 hours, but feel like you didn't write anything.
Well, that's sort of not true. In a way, if you're just staring out the window for a couple hours, figuring out what you want to work on or what you think would be funny or what's interesting, and even if you don't write anything that day, you're still writing if you're staring out the window just trying to figure it out. In fact, it was sort of the first thing my wife had to understand of like, so what do you mean you're going to go sit at the coffee shop? Yes, I'm going to have my laptop open and I'm going to maybe figure something out or maybe not, but that's just part of the process, you know.
So your mind is probably going all the time.
It's part of why like I'm harder on watching TV shows and movies, because if I could see the seams, then I'm taken out of it and I can't enjoy it. So that's like when I fall in love with a movie, it's probably a really good movie because you don't see what's coming. You don't hear the writer writing, you know, it just, you get lost in it. So then that's a really good, you know, because my brain is constantly, you know, it knows the formulas and the connections and why, you know, I make my wife crazy because I'll go like, literally be like, on 3, the baby cries, 3, 2, 1, and the baby cries at the funeral, you know.
A predetermined process, if you will. You had a book out. It's a funny thing. Why comedy made you bald. What was the tagline?
How the professional comedy business made me fat and bald. Fat and I don't take that off, but believe me, I'm white bald. But it's this book I would recommend to people who want to get into business just to get an idea of what the journey is like, starting from the time you feel like you think you're funny to how to then move out of your hometown and then make it a real profession and make it a real business, and seeing how far you go and what the roller coaster ride is like. And it's really a tale of like, if I could do it, this little teenage kid from a small factory town, if I could do it, there's no reason why you can't do it. You know, part of what holds people back is fear. You know, fear is the big deciding factor. Fear is the thing that keeps people from moving out of their hometown and taking the big swing. So it's kind of about, if you can get past that, or if you can fight through that, you find a very satisfying life on the other side. You know, but it's also something I wrote thinking of like, what's a book I would have loved to have found when I was a teenager thinking about this life. I mean, it's never going to be a big seller, though it's sold so many more than I ever thought it would. But I think it's a good lesson on how anyone who's interested in anything big that they want to go for in life, you can look at this journey and say, okay, here's all these roadblocks, and here's how this person got past it. You know, so even if it's like you're looking to be the owner of your own company or your own corporation, or you want to be president of this company, whatever it is that you have these big goals. It's like kind of saying, don't be afraid, just face the danger and go through it. And it may not, in other words, it's almost like what could kind of hurt more is the regret of not fighting for what you want, rather than the hurt that comes for fighting and getting some of, or most of all of.
Well, you seem very, very genuine. You seem, you know, it comes from a very strong place. It's hard to find that. I've talked to a lot of people in the business, and I think you're very true artist. So maybe the book's the movie. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's kind of if that's the real life, maybe that's the movie.
I parts of this book to write some pilots. There's a big part in here that people might be interested in, that when I moved from my hometown to New York City, I worked at a AV repair shop, and part of my job was to every couple of weeks go to Times Square in New York City and work on the projection equipment in the porn theaters. So I was, you know, thrown into the underbelly of New York City I was 19, 20 years old, and like my experiences in that world was, you know, so I actually made a pilot out of that. As soon as I finished it, David Simon came out with a show called the 40 Deuce. And in fact, that was the same exact name of my pilot. The 40 Deuce is 42nd Street. And then it was so close that I actually was able to get to David Simon and say, I lived this life. I wrote a pilot about it. This is my world. I think it'd be great if you brought me in as a writer. And I just kind of fought for this. But he kept saying there's just no way he could read my script, because if there's similarities, then it's a problem. And I said, I'll get a lawyer. We can sign the thing. And that was a little frustrating. But yeah, I'm going to go back to it. In fact, I don't know if you know Carol Leifer, a stand-up comedian who's been a friend for a long time. And I worked on her half-hour
I've heard the name.
She had a sitcom right after. She was a writer on Seinfeld, and then had her own show for a couple seasons. And it's funny, I just heard from her, and she read the book just out of the blue, which is great. But she said the same exact thing you're saying. Like, this book itself is a movie. We
haven't really showcased heroes in a long time. I mean, it's somewhat of an American hero type story, right? Guy from a small town showing his path and his career, you know, from a real perspective. It's educational. I don't know. Maybe it's something to think about. I think you're
right, because it does have the honesty that I'm always searching for, you know. So I've been thinking about it. The best way to maybe figure something out.
Well, I've took up a lot of your time today, and I appreciate the conversation.
My pleasure.
I think it's
fun.
I think we kind of dove into some different things, and that's what I try to do. I try to pull out these micro moments, kind of like your book, you know, about a micro moment in someone's life. So if someone's ever listening to this in 10 years, 20 years, they can learn something from it. You know, and I think because that's how we learn life. You know, our path of learning life is seeing how other people live. That teaches you the most about life in general, seeing how other people live, and, you know, opens your perspective and everything else. Yeah. So I'm trying to kind of encapsulate that here in this podcast.
I get that.
Get the book. It's a funny thing. If you want to learn about a true path in comedy from a great mind and great writer, Mr. Michael Rowe. Great conversation today. Appreciate you coming on the show. I'm John Edmonds Cosma, the CEO of Bang Productions.